ODOT has an agreement with the University of Oklahoma to house their cultural resources specialist at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. And I wanted to throw up just the folks that are part of our program. Myself and Robert Bartlett sort of run the program. We've got 3 archaeologists, 2 architectural historians, and a tribal liaison. We've got 39 federally recognized tribes in the state of Oklahoma, so her job's pretty taxing as well. So what we do is we look at cultural resources. We're cultural resource specialists. The term cultural resource describes a broad range of historic and cultural elements of society. Cultural resources they're divided into 5 types of properties. Buildings, anything with 4 walls and a roof. They're created principally to house human activity. This happens to be the Bazell Library in Norman, which is actually a National Historic Landmark. Structures, these are outside of buildings. They're made for purposes other than human shelter. This is the Carpenter's Bluff Bridge in Bryan County, Oklahoma, over the Red River into Texas. It was constructed in 1910, roughly, and it was originally a rail bridge, and you can see the wagon road off to the side there. And this is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Objects, they're artistic in nature, typically things like monuments or statues. We have very few of these that are important properties in the state. This happens to be the Pioneer Woman in Ponca City. Site, typically we're thinking of like an archaeological site. This is a prehistoric archaeological site that dates to roughly 1400 AD in western Oklahoma. And a site is anything that has human prehistoric or historic occupation. And then finally a district, and that's a collection of any of the aforementioned 4 resources, and they display some sort of continuity of sites, buildings, structures, or objects that are united in some sort of way. This is a historic district in Oklahoma City. We've got several of these. We have 5 archaeological districts in the state. The step up from cultural resources is once a cultural resource has been determined eligible for or listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it becomes a historic property. That's the term that comes out of the legalese that we'll talk about. They're afforded protection under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and then Section 4F of the U.S. DOT Act, both of them signed on the same day in October of 1966. So both of those regulatory laws are older than NHPA, actually. The National Historic Preservation Act, which is largely what we follow, it's a procedural law, very much like NHPA. It folds in nicely with the NHPA process. It's legislation intended to preserve historical and archaeological sites in the United States of America, signed into policy on October 15th, 1966. And it articulated a national policy governing the protection of cultural resources or historic properties and created Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the National Register of Historic Places, the list of the National Historic Landmarks, and the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO. And it's, like I said, it's along with NHPA, it's a system of procedural steps that encourage cultural resource protection through consultation. It requires that every federal agency take into account the effects of the agency's undertaking on resources that are eligible for or listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and then prior to approval of the undertaking to afford the Advisory Council an opportunity to comment. And basically, it requires us to make a reasonable and good faith effort to identify properties that might be eligible for the National Register during our projects. The federal agency is responsible for the scope of the undertaking, the scope of the identification efforts, and determination of eligibility of the resource. Definitions, throw these up here. I'm just going to. The undertaking is a project, activity, or program funded in whole or in part by a federal agency. It could be permitted. It could occur on federal land, federal license or approval, and those subject to state or local regulation administered pursuant to a delegation or approval by a federal agency. And the synonym for that in NHPA is federal action. Historic property we discussed is any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object that's included in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And then effect is an alteration to the characteristic of the historic property that qualifying it for eligibility in the NRHP. And the impact is a synonym for that in NHPA lingo. Section 4F, unlike NHPA or Section 106, it's a substantive law or substantive law. It requires a hard look at resources, and with respect to historic properties, it's got its thumb on the scale of towards preservation. Signed into the same day as National Historic Preservation Act, and it only applies to U.S. DOT agencies. And basically the letter of the law is that the administration, that is, in our case, federal highways, may not approve the use of land from a significant publicly owned park, recreation area, or wildlife and waterfowl refuge, or any significant historic site unless a determination is made that there is no feasible and prudent alternative to the use of that land, and that the action has all possible planning to minimize harm to the property. And this is important because we often have resources that are eligible for or listed on the National Register that are part of our project, and bridges are the number one resource that we deal with. We've done 2 studies for historic bridges in the state that focus around trusses right now, and we're working on a study for those that are federal aid work programs, bridges from the 1930s Depression era. We're working on that study right now, and those will provide us a list of all of the National Register bridges that we have in the state pre-1945. Cultural resources commitments are any of those commitments made by the state DOT that have to do with places, things, and institutions that are regarded somehow as cultural or historical by any group of people. And these commitments include, but are not limited to, those made under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and or Section 4F of the DOT Act with regard to historic properties. I said that the National Historic Preservation Act encourages consultation. So we're always working with tribes, we're working with the local community and other organizations like the Historic Bridge Foundation. Cultural resource commitments are generally taken to mean commitments made in 4 categories. They'll come out of memoranda of agreements, programmatic agreements, what are called conditional no adverse effects findings under consultation with the SHPO, or they may arise outside of any of these formal assessments under the auspices of planning, design, development, or right-of-way negotiations. So the first one is a memorandum of agreement. It's developed as a result of an adverse effect to a resource. So if we have a bridge project, this is the Carpenter's Bluff Bridge again, and that bridge is going to be replaced, then that's an adverse effect to the bridge. The MOA is developed as a result of an adverse effect due to the proposed undertaking of the project. And the 2 types that we have the most adverse effects for are sites and structures. Here's a typical MOA for a bridge. I wanted to throw this up there. I would call this a routine MOA. This one it's a Choctaw County local government county project, and the county agreed to keep the bridge in its existing condition and then maintain the bridge in its existing condition. The proposed project was constructing a new bridge on a new alignment. The old bridge is being removed from the transportation system. However, the county will still allow folks access to the bridge. They've barricaded it so you can't get on it anymore. It won't be maintained in that fashion, but it will still be left for public viewing, and it's a truss bridge. Just, you know, several pages of whereases and therefores and what we're going to do. But then at the end, the signatory, the commitments, and we've got Federal Highways, the State Historic Preservation Office, ODOT, Don's signature, and the county commissioner. In this case, that would be the most important signature on there. They're the ones maintaining the bridge. A programmatic agreement, unlike a MOA, is usually developed at the beginning of a project. There's two types. It's project-specific programmatic agreement and a procedural PA. Procedural PA, there are 39 federally recognized tribes in the state, and we have programmatic agreements, I want to say with about a third of those right now. And those outline with the tribes what type of information they want to see for a project, and more importantly, many of them outline what we will do if we encounter a resource that would be important to them. And among those would be human remains as well. Project-specific PA is something you might put together before maybe an EIS or something like that, something where you know you're going to encounter a set of routine resources during the project, and you would work on a project-specific PA with the SHPO to deal with those resources as you encountered them. I think a lot of those probably came into being with the stimulus program. I think SHPO had a lot of those with that. They knew they're going after a lot of these projects, and so the agencies would put together PAs with SHPO for those. The main difference between the PA, as I said, and the MOA is that the PA is done at the beginning of the process, whereas an MOA is an after you've found something and you're trying to either mitigate an adverse effect or just work around avoiding that resource. The third type of commitment is a conditional no adverse effect. And a lot of times what we'll have is a project where we know we have a historic property. Route 66 might be an example, and we'll outline in our report with SHPO some actions that we'll take in order to avoid having an adverse effect to that resource. SHPO will write a letter in response to us reiterating those things and saying we'll concur with a no adverse effect provided that you follow the rules that you set out, and here are these rules. And we sign that and send that back to them. Sidewalk projects in historic districts are one. Historic bridge rehabilitations and fencing of archaeological sites that are adjacent to project areas. The historic districts, a lot of times, will do projects that involve construction of new sidewalks in districts where sidewalk was not originally there. And these are safe routes to school projects that SHPO and most of our consulting parties agree that you want to provide safe routes for children to go to school. So there is a need for sidewalks. They'll respond with something like, you can put the sidewalk here as long as it does not exceed a width of 4 feet. It's constructed of like-in-kind materials to the district. For instance, if you think of Guthrie, you might, there's brick sidewalks and things like that we might commit to for that project. Other types of commitments are plan notes for off-site avoidance. Archaeological sites within 1 mile of the project area. If during our background studies we find that there are any resource that might be eligible or unassessed for the National Register, we'll put a borrow or staging or plant construction note, and that's basically what it says. They're potentially significant. I think Dawn showed a slide with one of these on here, and we'll either put the legal location of where that resource would be. We don't specify what that resource is. Oftentimes we'll get responses from tribes telling us to avoid things, and to be sensitive to their request for not making that public, we won't say what the resource really is, but we'll also put station locations as well if we know what those are, if we have a set of plans. Like I said, that we did have the Cherokee responded with a traditional plant resource that they wanted us to avoid, and so we included that as a plan note, and then a burial location of a chief that the Choctaw responded to. So those are two recent examples. And this would be sort of what I'm talking about. Those red areas are archaeological sites that haven't been assessed, so we would put in plan notes for any of those resources that are not within the study area proper, to avoid the take a borrow fill or anything like that. And our avoidance memos are only as good as unless there is another federal agency involved. You say one of those is on a BIA land, for instance, you would still need to consult with the BIA. They would have their own regulatory requirements for acquiring borrow. Osage County happens to be one with a lot. Yeah. Post-review discoveries. Who would? The contractor would. Yes, I believe the contractor would.
Yeah, we don't consider those actions under NHPA. Federal Highway doesn't consider those actions under NHPA, but BIA is very interested in them. They have issue with that.
Contact the BIA archaeologist.
Yeah.
It would then in turn go back to the shipbuilder.
That's exactly right. Do the process over for that. But post-review, inadvertent finds. Archaeological sites that are not found during the Section 106 consultation are often uncovered during the construction. I said before, what we're required to do is a reasonable and good faith effort. We're not going to find everything, and we can't find everything. So oftentimes during construction, something will be uncovered. It could be human remains. It could be just an archaeological site. It could be a brick or a piece of styrofoam. But ODOT has procedures in place to review these, and these are implemented for construction and off-project activities. And as I said, with many of the tribes, we have agreements with them on how we would handle a human remains or an archaeological site that's exposed.
The modern archaeological site.
The modern,
The
we get a lot of those, yeah. And we're,
people think ancient. And it's not.
yeah, an archaeological site's anything over 45 years old. So, the National Historic Preservation Act considers resources that are over 45. We look at 45 years, it's actually 50 years old. That changes things quite a bit.
Yeah.
But we look at things 45 years of age or older to allow for the construction let date and things like that. So we've got a buffer in there. But the Federal Highways Administration and other federal agencies are looking really hard these days about how to make a cutoff. I mean, right now we're talking 1967. Anything older than that, we're recording and assessing for National Register eligibility. And that's getting close to my age, I know. 2 years.
That means I'm already history.
Exactly. If there's any federal funds or permitting for you, we need to assess you. So if subsurface archaeological materials are exposed during construction, the contractor and resident engineer shall notify the department archaeologist in accordance with section 202.04A. And that's just a standard mitigation note that we have. So I thought I'd go through a couple of examples of some recent commitments that we've made. This is the Threatt filling station. I'm going to have to go to my notes on this one because I got so many of these. It's on Route 66. It was constructed in 1915, and it was an African-American-owned filling station. And it's eligible for, it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This portion of Route 66 is no longer eligible, but there are many resources along this. The incidental construction stops right about where I'm standing. I'm shooting to the west, to the east towards Luther. I'm sorry, away from Luther. And we said we would avoid this resource, and then the SHPO actually responded back saying, we'd like to see a more detailed plan note that says that you're going to cone this area off or fence this area off, because we don't want people smoking, we don't want people hanging out, we don't want people sitting on that porch while they're doing the construction activity for this. So we revised the plan note, and they gave us a conditional no adverse effect, provided that we put those cones there. This is the Roosevelt Bridge over Lake Texoma. This is a resource also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the longest bridge in the state. It's 4,900 feet long. It's a truss bridge. You can barely see the truss in the back. And it was constructed in 1942. And the commitment there, this is going to be a little challenging to see, I think. The commitment here was that the ODOT was putting some fiber line along a fiber project throughout the entire state of Oklahoma. And we committed to putting the fiber line underneath the deck, and the conduit underneath the deck. Well, when the contractor got out there, this is the south side of the bridge, and I'm looking to the west. This is the north side of the bridge. We said we would put it underneath the south side of the bridge, hidden from view, and SHPO concurred with that, no problem. When the contractor got out there, there were some issues with an electrical line underneath here, I believe, and Don, you may expand upon that too if you remember anything else. But there were some issues with safety, and so the contractor went ahead and put the conduit in a little triangle-shaped area on the north side of the bridge. So it's on the north side of the bridge. It was supposed to be on the south, and it's exposed in conduit, metal conduit, where it was supposed to be hidden from view. And we didn't find this out until after the fact, which reopened consultation with SHPO. Unfortunately, this one, they concurred that it was not an adverse effect. It really could have been a terrible thing, because the contractor put all of the conduit up. What did I just do? There we go. I paused. And so this is a bad example. This is the 101 Ranch. The project's State Highway 156 over the Arkansas River in Kay County. The 101 Ranch was constructed in roughly 1892. It's a National Historic Landmark as well. And the truss bridge, it's part of a district. The buildings were taken down. The ranch closed down in roughly 1940s, and then the buildings were taken out sometime after that. They used to be all up in here. Right now it's a big archaeological site. But during our investigations for the bridge replacement, we determined that there was a ferry crossing right here, and the commitments had that we would barbed wire that off and leave that alone. So you can see here where the contractor fenced this off with barbed wire and disallowed access to where the ferry crossing was. This is the Murrell home, another National Historic Landmark, Park Hill Branch County Road project. The bridge, I believe, actually washed out before we could, and this happens frequently enough. The bridge washed out, and so it was sort of an emergency. We need to hit this pretty hard now. And the Murrell home is back over here. It's an where did I put that? Oh, they're 1845 Cherokee home mansion that was constructed. It's still in place. And so the SHPO responded. We went and did a little archaeological and cultural resources survey, and SHPO wanted these trees left alone, this whole area cordoned off, so that we were staying away from that property as much as possible. And then finally, this is the Fort Washita. It's a state highway project over the Washita River. And Fort Washita was constructed in 1842. I believe all the buildings there now are reconstructions, but it's still a National Historic Landmark and a significant archaeological site as well. And basically, to avoid archaeological resources that might be encountered just adjacent to the ODOT's right-of-way here, this area is fenced off, and we're also being contacted by the contractor when there's any construction dirt activity going on out there. And one thing that Robert wanted me to add is that in the plan notes, if there's something about contacting the state archaeologist, don't assume that it's been done. I mean, it doesn't hurt for us to get 3 or 4 phone calls. If the contractor sees a note that maybe the inspector is supposed to contact the department archaeologist, there's no harm in anyone down that list going ahead and doing that. The resources I just discussed here are, all National Historic Landmarks, so they're fairly important to the state.